$590 billion. In the modern world, that number is almost incomprehensible. It is more than the market cap of some of the world's largest tech giants. It is more than the cost to build the International Space Station, the Burj Khalifa, and the world's most expensive skyscrapers combined. If you took every ounce of gold currently sitting in the Federal Reserve of the United States, you would still be short of the budget allocated for a single building constructed 3 millennia ago. But the cost isn't the most shocking part of this story. The real mystery lies in the silence. For 7 years, as 183,000 men moved mountains of limestone and rivers of gold across the Judean wilderness, not a single hammer was heard on the construction site. No iron chisels clinking against rock, no saws biting into wood, no ringing of metal against metal. Jerusalem, at the peak of its golden age, was a city of 150,000 workers swarming like ants in a total, eerie, and supernatural silence. How? How do you construct a monument made of 100-ton stones and massive cedar beams without a single adjustment on site? Mainstream history called it advanced prefabrication. But the ancient Hebrew texts, the ones they don't usually read in Sunday school, hint at something far more technical. They speak of a lost technology that could slice through solid granite as if it were soft wax. They called it the Shamir. Today, we are going beneath the gold, past the legends, and into the dark, silent quarries of King Solomon. This is the forensic breakdown of the most expensive and most mysterious construction project in human history. To understand the son, you have to understand the obsession of the father. King Solomon inherited a fortune, but he also inherited a burden. Picture David in his final years. He's no longer the giant killer or the warrior who united the tribes. He is a man consumed by a single vision, a permanent house for his God. Since the time of the Exodus, the presence of God had lived in a tent, the tabernacle, a portable, weathered structure designed for a wandering people. But David wanted a monument. There was just one problem. God said no. The text in 2 Samuel 7 is clear. David was a man of war. His hands had shed too much blood. A house of shalom, of peace, required a man of peace. That man was his son, Solomon. But David didn't just sit back. He spent the last decades of his life as the world's most effective logistics officer. He hoarded war spoils from every conquered kingdom, from the Nile to the Euphrates. 1 Chronicles 22 reveals a scale of preparation that borders on madness. David set aside 100,000 talents of gold and 1,000,000 talents of silver. From his personal fortune alone, he added another 3,000 talents of Ophir gold, the highest quality gold known to antiquity. Let's do the math that your history teacher skipped. 1 talent was about 75 pounds. That means Solomon's gold reserves totaled roughly 3,400 metric tons. At today's prices, that is roughly $493 billion in gold alone. Add the silver, and you're looking at another $80 to $100 billion. David left his son with a treasury that could buy the world, but he didn't have the materials. He didn't have the wood. He didn't have the master craftsmen. For that, Solomon would have to make a deal with the merchant kings of the north. Israel was an agricultural nation. They were farmers, vintners, and shepherds. They knew how to survive the desert, but they had no experience with monumental stone cutting or high-end timber work. If Solomon wanted the best, he had to go to King Hiram of Tyre. Tyre was the maritime superpower of the Mediterranean. Their sailors had mapped the stars, and their craftsmen were the most sought after in the ancient world. More importantly, they controlled the Lebanese cedars. These weren't just trees, they were the steel of antiquity. They grew over 100 feet tall, were naturally resistant to rot and insects, and had a grain so dense it could support the weight of a stone roof without buckling. Solomon sent a diplomatic letter to Hiram, preserved in 1 Kings 5. He wasn't asking for a gift, he was proposing a trade deal that would define the economy of the region for a generation. The price was staggering. Every year for 20 years, Israel would send 4,400 tons of wheat and 440,000 liters of pressed olive oil to Tyre. In exchange, Hiram would provide the wood and the expertise. But getting the trees was only 10% of the battle. The logistics were a nightmare. Imagine the scene. Thousands of Phoenician loggers felling these giants in the mountains. The logs were then dragged down to the sea, lashed together into massive rafts, and floated 200 miles down the coast to the harbor of Joppa. From Joppa, the wood had to go inland. Jerusalem sits 800 meters high, 60 kilometers of rocky, climbing terrain away from the coast. There were no trucks, no cranes, just sledges, grease, and raw human muscle. Every single beam of that $590 billion temple had to be dragged up those hills by hand. And that brings us to the workers, the 183,000 men who actually built the silence. We often hear the story of Solomon's temple as a triumph of faith, but for the men on the ground, it was a triumph of endurance, and for many, a sentence of misery. Solomon conscripted 10% of his entire nation. In modern terms, that would be like the United States mobilizing 33 million people for a single construction project. The workforce was a rigid hierarchy. At the top were the 30,000 Israelites. They worked in rotations, 1 month in the Lebanese mountains, 2 months home with their families. It was hard, but it was humane. But beneath them were the 150,000 carriers and stonecutters. These weren't Israelites. They were the Moss, the descendants of the conquered Canaanite tribes. For them, there was no rotation. There were no 2 months off. They were permanent conscripts, essentially state slaves. Think about the irony. The temple of the God who liberated Israel from Egyptian slavery was built largely by the hands of forced laborers. The house of peace was built on the backs of men who were treated as tools. The man in charge of this massive operation was Adoniram, the minister of forced labor. He was the most hated man in Israel. Years later, after Solomon died, the people didn't just rebel against the king, they found Adoniram in the street and stoned him to death. The temple's stones were laid in silence, but they were soaked in the resentment of 150,000 men who were reaching their breaking point. But why the silence? Why would Solomon make an already impossible task even more difficult by banning the sound of metal? 1 Kings 6:7 contains one of the strangest engineering requirements in ancient history. It states that no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built. This wasn't just a stylistic choice, it was a theological law. In the ancient Israelite worldview, iron was the metal of war. Iron was what you used to make swords and spearheads. God had commanded in Exodus that if you used a tool on an altar, you defiled it. Solomon extended this to the entire building. The house of peace could not be touched by the tools of war. This meant that Solomon's engineers had to execute a level of prefabrication that still baffles modern architects. Every single stone had to be cut to its exact final dimensions at the quarry, miles away. There could be no trimming on site, no shaving off an inch to make it fit. Imagine the pressure on the quarry teams. They were working with 100-ton blocks. If one block was off by just a few millimeters, the entire wall, a wall covered in gold, would be compromised. To achieve this, they went underground. Directly beneath the city of Jerusalem lies a massive limestone cavern known today as Zedekiah's Quarries. It is a 5-acre cathedral of stone. Down there in the total darkness, lit only by flickering oil lamps, 80,000 men spent 7 years cutting stone. They used a specific type of limestone called meliki, or royal stone. Meliki has a bizarre property. When it is underground, it is soft and easy to carve, almost like clay. But the moment it is exposed to the air and the sun, it hardens into marble-like durability. The workers would carve deep channels into the soft rock, drive wooden wedges into the gaps, and pour water over them. As the wood expanded, it would snap the stone with a clean, surgical break. But how did they get the precision? How did they ensure that 10,000 different stones cut in different tunnels by different teams would fit together like a giant silent Lego set? This is where the legend of the Shamir enters the forensic record. While mainstream archaeology talks about wedges and water, the ancient Jewish Talmud records a much stranger story. Solomon knew that he could not use iron tools even at the quarry if he wanted the temple to be truly holy. So he sought out a substance that could cut stone without metal. The texts describe the Shamir as a creature or a worm the size of a barley corn. It was so powerful that it had to be kept in a lead box wrapped in wool because its gaze or its touch would disintegrate any other material. When the Shamir was placed on a line drawn on a stone, the stone would split perfectly along that line, leaving a surface as smooth as a polished glass. If we look at this through the lens of impossible engineering, we have three theories. What was this? The biological acid theory? Was the Shamir a highly corrosive biological substance, a prehistoric acid or an enzyme that could dissolve limestone on contact? The sonic technology theory. Ancient cultures from Egypt to India have legends of using sound to manipulate stone. Was the Shamir a nickname for a sonic tool, a device that used high-frequency vibrations to shatter the molecular bonds of the rock? The advanced lost tech theory. Some theorists argue that the description of the Shamir, something small that must be kept in lead, sounds remarkably like a radioactive isotope or a precision laser tool that Solomon somehow possessed. Whatever the Shamir was, the result was a building that looked as if it had been grown rather than built. When the stones arrived at the site, they fit together so perfectly that you couldn't slide a razor blade between the joints. It was a miracle of engineering, executed in a silence that felt like a permanent prayer. Once the stones were in place, the silence continued, but the aesthetic changed. The interior of Solomon's temple was a sensory overload of wealth. Every inch of the limestone walls was covered in cedar planks, and every inch of those cedar planks was overlaid with gold. The text says Solomon garnished the house with precious stones for beauty. Imagine walking into a room that is 30 feet tall, where the floor is gold, the walls are gold, and the ceiling is gold. There are no windows. The only light comes from 10 solid gold lampstands, their flames reflecting off the polished metal until the room feels like it is made of solid light. But the gold wasn't just for show. It was a shield. The Holy of Holies, the innermost room, was a perfect cube. Inside sat the Ark of the Covenant, protected by two massive cherubim made of gold, their wings spanning 15 feet across the room. The gold acted as a conductor, a resonance chamber. On the day of the dedication, as 183,000 workers stood outside in the courtyard, Solomon prayed. What happened next is recorded in 2 Chronicles 5:14. A cloud, the Shekinah, filled the house. It wasn't smoke, it wasn't fog, it was a tangible, physical weight of glory. The Bible says the priests could not stand to minister. They were physically pushed to the ground by the density of the presence. 7 years of silent labor, 183,000 lives spent, $590 billion in precious metals. It all culminated in a moment where the creator of the universe moved into a house built by human hands. Heaven had touched the sand of Jerusalem. But the silence of the construction eventually led to the scream of the destruction. Solomon's temple stood for nearly 400 years. but the debt Solomon had accumulated to build it nearly destroyed the country. To pay King Hiram of Tyre for the wood and the workers, Solomon had to give away 20 cities in the north of Israel. When Hiram went to see the cities, he was so disappointed he called them Kabul, which means worthless. The forced labor, the moss, created a bitterness that never went away. Within one generation of Solomon's death, the 10 northern tribes rebelled and the kingdom split. The House of Peace had inadvertently planted the seeds of civil war. And finally, in 586 BC, the silence was broken forever. The Babylonian army, led by Nebuchadnezzar, breached the walls of Jerusalem. They didn't just loot the temple, they dismantled it. They smashed the massive bronze pillars, they stripped the gold from the walls, they burned the Lebanese cedar until the smell of the forest was replaced by the smell of ash. The most expensive building in history was reduced to a pile of scorched limestone in just 4 days. But here is the final mystery. When the Babylonians inventoried the loot, counting every golden spoon and silver bowl with obsessive precision, they noticed something missing. The Ark of the Covenant was gone. The most important object in the temple, the very reason the $590 billion monument existed, was not on the list. It didn't end up in the treasury of Babylon. Some say the priests hid it in the tunnels below the city. Others say it was taken by the Shamir itself. To this day, the silence of the temple remains. The stones are gone, the gold is melted, but the question echoes through history. What are we building today that is worthy of that kind of silence? Solomon's temple was more than just an engineering feat. It was a statement that the divine could live among the common. It was a marriage of human skill and supernatural presence. But if the presence of God left the temple before the fires of Babylon arrived, as the prophet Ezekiel claimed, then what was the gold really for? Was the building the miracle? Or was the silence of the men who built it the real act of worship? If you could ask King Solomon one question about the Shamir or about the men who died in those dark quarries, what would it be? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one of them. And if you want to know the dark secrets of King Solomon's harem or the forbidden menu of what the apostles actually ate for dinner, click the video on your screen right now. We are just getting started.